Okay, welcome everybody to our session entitled the Infrastructure Africa Plenary. It's the challenges and perspectives for the African continent during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, and the role of the proposed or in progress African Continental Free Trade Agreement. My name is Martin Davis, and I'm the MD of Emerging Markets in Africa at Deloitte, based today here in Johannesburg. It's a real pleasure having you all here. We have a great panel of speakers, and I'll be introducing them shortly. But just to set the scene for the topic for our conversation over the next 45 minutes to an hour or so, is we've seen, there's almost arguably there's a marginalization of the global South. Think Latin America, think Africa, where there's been significant stimulus spending throughout the COVID pandemic period, particularly in Europe, in North America, quantitative easing, the like. There seems to be almost a marginalization, as I call it, not so much a deglobalization, which has been the discussion topic of late, but a marginalization where we're somewhat restricted in flows of capital, flows of labor, i.e. talent, flows of foreign direct investment, finance, and to an extent flows of goods and services. And the real challenge is, how do we as African countries, or Africa as a region, but also African countries, stand up, do the necessary, carry out the necessary structural reforms to really drive growth and recover and drive our economies and recover back to what was a pre-COVID sort of period. Of course, a lot of headwinds in the global economy right now. So what are the real drivers of growth? What are the levers that we can pull, perhaps, in the African continent to drive growth? One of which, a perennial lever, is that of infrastructure. And something, how do we spend in a qualitative fashion, spending on infrastructure that can drive growth, really underpin growth, be economic enabling infrastructure, and again, supported by what is a very positive free trade agenda in the continent in recent times as well. So let me introduce our speakers this morning. Firstly, I have, in no particular order, just as they come up, Stavros Nicolaou. Stavros is very well known in South Africa. He is the Group Senior Executive of Strategic Trade Development at one of the leading pharmaceutical companies in the region, Aspen Pharmacare Holdings. And Stavros is doing an enormous amount of work around local value chains, deepening of local value chains around pharma and pharmaceutical products in recent times. We have Kudzani Bangure, who's a program manager of Africa Infrastructure Desk at the NEPAD Business Foundation, MBF. The MBF is very active in promoting infrastructure, coordination, development support, not just in South Africa, but the wider region as well. And this is something which, from Kudzani's perspective, is how is business and how is government really working, or should be working better together to drive infrastructure spend as an underpin of growth in our part of the world. We have Ben Laker. Ben is the acting CEO of DRC Invest, and also the Chief Executive Officer of the African Agri Council. Ben is currently sitting in Kinshasa, but obviously traveled a lot around the continent. And his big expertise is really in deepening value chains in the agricultural space. Last and certainly not least, we have Matt Cullinan. Is the Infrastructure Executive at Atlantis Special Economic Zone, based down in the Western Cape. And as you may be aware, Atlantis is really, for quite a number of years now, but with now some enabling policy, perhaps some more recognition from central government, is looking to create an industrial node that is this SEZ up the west coast of South Africa, Western Cape, in and around Atlantis. So without further ado, Stavros, I'd like just to invite you in terms of saying, well, what are your observations around deepening value chains? We obviously could maybe a bit more of a focus on the pharmaceutical sector, perhaps. But how do are African governments thinking enough around deepening value chains, and particularly in light of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, will that have an impact going forward? Stavros, over to you.
Martin, firstly, good morning, and thanks very much to yourself and the organizers, of course. These are all very important conversations that need to be held on the continent. There's probably no better example for me to illustrate than to take you through what happened during the COVID pandemic. So at the onset of the pandemic, January, February 2020, as we know, the whole world said, look, we're going to act in solidarity, we're going to act together, we're going to beat this pandemic, right? Until it came to a frenzied scramble for vaccines. And everyone needed to be vaccinated, but there were a limited amount of vaccines, demand far outstripping supply. And guess what happened, Martin? Solidarity went out the window. It was more akin to anyone watching this that knows Hunger Games. It's every man for himself, and you don't really worry about the next person. I'm not exaggerating that, because this is in fact how it played out. Africa was left at the back end of the queue, and it's only those who had their own capabilities and capacities on the continent that were able to vaccinate their populations first, and of course better respond to the pandemic. So what was the lesson? One lesson of many, many different lessons, of course, that we learned, and a particular spotlight was shone on the lack of industrial capacity on the continent, the lack of localization policies. At best, these policies are, exist on paper, but are never implemented. And it required a different type of thinking from the African continent. But what we needed to do, and I'm pleased to report that there's extensive work going on around this, we don't have the muscle of a China, a Europe, a US, etc. But what we can do is we can start competing if we aggregate all our volumes. So there are 1.3 billion people that reside on our continent, and there's a lot to be said around aggregating volumes to enable you to get economies of scale. And even if you're not producing locally, just to put yourself in a negotiating position to get product when there's this frenzy scramble, as I described it earlier, becomes a very important element. So what am I taking out of this? I'm taking two things out of it. The first is the continent it's saddled with the worst disease burden of any continent. We have 16% of the world's population, but harbor 27% of its disease burden. So we should be producing more of these products on the continent. So lesson number one is get a coordinated localization policy going on the continent. And I'm pleased to tell you that the African Union, the Africa CDC, have grabbed the bull by the horns. There is now at the very least a white paper that exists that looks promising. But I guess, Martin, the proof is going to be in the pudding. I'm also pleased to say that during these emergency times, the world doubts you. They say, well, even if we give you technologies, are you going to be able to produce your product? A lot of Afro-pessimism exists on the continent, but pleased to tell you that in the instance of Aspen, we were able to record in record time a technology transfer to produce the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. As I said, that was in record time, and several millions of doses were produced for and on behalf of Johnson & Johnson, but out of a Quebec facility in the Eastern Cape on the African continent. So that was kind of lesson number one, is we need a coherent localization policy that spans the entirety of the continent. But that doesn't mean that all 55 African countries can now go and put up vaccine capacity. It doesn't work that way. The model that is being proposed is regional manufacturing with a strong element of complementarity and supplementarity. So complementing the different manufacturing strengths of the regions is an important consideration, so that you can best optimize the economies of scale that aggregating 1.3 billion population provides for you. The second lesson I want to touch on, and it really goes to the heart of industrialization. I'm not going to cover the Afro-pessimism in any more detail, I mean, suffice to say that, you know, Aspen proved that it can be done on the continent, and I think our record speaks for itself. But you're getting to discussions such as, for example, does the continent have the skills? Does it have the technologies? And you can only really build these skills and technologies through partnerships. So we're starting to see the emergence of partnerships which forge ahead pathways for technology transfers. And again, these arrangements and agreements are not possible without having an aggregation of the volumes. So if you aggregate the volumes, it suddenly starts making sense for a tech partner. There are many more lessons that I can go through, and I'll probably have the opportunity later on. But in the context, just in conclusion, in the context of today's conversation, which is very much an African free trade and localization, industrialization conversation, what the free trade agreement does do, it starts getting a mindset around aggregating those volumes. And for me, that's immensely beneficial in any localization discussion. Of course, I hope I'll have the opportunity to come back and tease out some of the aspects of localization later on. But the starting point in any localization conversation is, do you have economies of scale and volume throughput? And I think for the first time now, we can get that through the Africa Free Trade Agreement. Thanks very much.
Stavros, thank you. That's great. I'll come back to some of the points you raised shortly. But leading on to Kudzanai, is, you know, there's a bit of a chicken egg situation here. We're having these debates for ages that, you know, will the free trade agenda, proposed policy negotiations, will they result in significant growth in trade when the infrastructure to carry trade is often lacking? Which comes first, free trade or enabling infrastructure? I don't want to guide your opening remarks too much, but perhaps you could address that up front.
Thanks for that, Martin, and thanks to the organizers for allowing us to participate in this session. Now, I think the question you raised is a critical question, and the issue of infrastructure is at the heart of unlocking the real value that the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement can deliver. And I'll canvass my comments on three key areas. So when you're talking about infrastructure, there's the first key element that speaks to missing links, if you would like, connecting the unconnected. There's another key area that looks at the efficiencies of the existing infrastructure that is currently in place. And whether you're talking about transportation and you're talking about new bridges that are being built, as an example, Kazungula Bridge, or if you're within the transmission space and you're talking about new transmission lines that are required in order for you to evacuate power from one point of generation to another point where it needs to be consumed. All these key issues are vital when you're talking about regional integration and regional trade. So I think that's the first key thing, that the lifeblood of operationalizing and executing and implementing a lot of what the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement seeks to do really does rely on leveraging infrastructure as the blood that will carry that trade through. So I think that's the first key one. I think the approach really has to be incremental in terms of how that is done. So if you look at the issue of efficiencies as an example, one has to look at it and say, if you have certain infrastructure that is currently in place, how can be the government entities or the responsible authorities leverage that existing infrastructure, remove the bottlenecks that are currently there in order to allow greater trade to flow? And here we're talking about issues at borders as an example, and a lot of procedural issues, a lot of planning issues that hinder that free flow of goods and services. And as we go into the session, we can probably go into a lot of detail in terms of just some specific examples of where these things manifest themselves. So I think that's a critical one. But the other key element is in the element of bringing in the private sector and what role the private sector can play in unlocking infrastructure as that key lifeblood that should actually help in driving the African continental free trade area. And there's a lot happening locally in South Africa that we can look to, a lot of positive signals. If we take Transnet as an example, there's a lot of work that they're doing in terms of private sector participation, processes, programs, RFPs, RFIs, call it what you would like, around a range of key issues, whether you're talking about DCT, Durban Container Terminal, whether you're talking about the NATCOR, the Natal Corridor, or even if you're talking about potential new LNG facilities either in Richards Bay or in Kucha. There's a lot that is currently happening with that, and picking up from what Stavros was saying about the mindset and the frame of mind that is currently at play in terms of how to unlock either what you currently have or building on top of what you currently have and essentially creating what you require. So I think that's the other key element, that you need to have the infrastructure in place, you need to leverage what you already have, but bringing in the private sector, I think is a key element of actually getting that done. Now, to come back to your original question, what comes first? I think one has to look at it and say that if you look at the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, it is a tool. It's a tool that essentially is trying to deal with either non-tariff barriers or tariff barriers or protectionist policies, rules, or way of doing business that has gone on for a significant amount of time. And it's what you typically would find in a block that is obviously not harmonized, and it currently is segregated, if you would like. So it is a tool, and that tool can only be effective if it actually leverages what is currently there. I'll give you a practical example. If you look at some of the recent developments that you've had in South Africa, where the Maputo corridor, you previously had a rail operation there that required multiple handovers for trains that were running out of South Africa going all the way through to Maputo, where you would have, as an example, 4 locomotives that would hook up, go all the way through to Belfast and then all the way through to Komati, and then they would hand over to CFM, 2 diesel locomotives that then run all the way through into Maputo. Yeah. Now they've got a seamless operation through some agreements that have been put in place. Now, this has happened, arguably, one could say, outside of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The need to actually open up that channel, that border, and remove the border and have a virtual border, not a physical border where you require those handovers. So the question of what comes first, the tool is critical in order to accelerate single borders, single window systems. It's critical to accelerate the planning that you require between 2 countries. But a lot of that can happen now. So it's good that we have that tool and it can accelerate that process. But if you look at all the OSBPs that have been set up all across the region, a lot of those were already being set up prior to the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. However, with the tool in place, one almost has a framework to lean on to accelerate that process. So I would almost say we shouldn't wait for ratification of certain key things. There are a lot of negotiations that are still happening in terms of the AfCFTA. I think a lot of the phase 1 part of it has been done, but the phase 2 and the phase 3 is still very much in the pipeline. But regardless of that, there's a lot that can be done now to start making sure you've got single window systems operating, to ensure you've got seamless border operations, to get these kinds of agreements like Transnet has done with CFM that can allow you to have a through train operation, which is what the AfCFTA is trying to achieve in any event.
Got it. Because I thank you. Just I'll come back to some of the points you raised as well, particularly on the Transnet side, and I want to talk about privatization of infrastructure, which you allude to. But Matt, I mean, both Stavros and Kuds and I mentioned the phrase mindset, or the word mindset. Are you noticing where you are, Matt, a mindset shift that the real driver of this industrial process, maybe even infrastructure enablement, is not state capital, but it's private? What do you think?
Yeah, I think without a doubt, and I think there is certainly, and to add to that, I would say what we're seeing is a very strong, what one might call African or domestic appetite for investment and new investment. So, you know, typically special economic zones and stuff are set up on the basis that you create this sort of attractive suite of incentives, and and you get this foreign direct investment, and you get your jobs and technology and all those good things. And of course, in reality, we know that that doesn't happen or doesn't work, and certainly has not really worked in South Africa. So, I think we've got to be quite realistic, but also I think we can be optimistic about the appetite that we have in South Africa for new ventures and for really capturing the opportunities that are emerging in the continent. I think when I look at the kind of pipeline of investors that are interested, and when I say pipeline, it has to be taken as that not all of these are going to be successful. They've all got various challenges, various hurdles that they need to overcome. But it's a wide range of industries in the sort of green tech space, because the Atlantis SEZ is a green tech SEZ. So we target really companies that are going to be contributing to the green economy, predominantly in your sort of wind energy, solar energy space, but also your clean tech, transport, battery is an interesting area we're exploring, and some of those other aspects. So I think certainly there's good private sector interest and good domestic interest. I think everything that has been said by the previous two speakers, I think I find myself nodding my head. SEZs are not, or any industrial zone, but particularly government-funded ones like us, they're not going to be successful just because they offer incentives. And in fact, if you build your SEZ on the basis of incentives, I think that's just the wrong way to go. But there are two things that are really critical in this space. And the one is sort of really clear government policy or policy consistency from a government perspective. No investor, and this applies to infrastructure as well. And it's one of the problems, that McKinsey talks about as well when they talk about the African infrastructure paradox, is that there's funding, there's a pipeline, there's a need for spending, but not enough money is being spent. And there are a whole host of reasons for that, as you all well know. But one of the factors is that sense of certainty that if we put this money down, there's going to be consistency in the commitment and the kind of trajectory of a particular policy course. The other thing is that, you can do as much promotion and investment promotion and something, but unless there's a market, you're not going to get development. Any manufacturing activity is going to set up in response to markets. And those markets generally are existing or emerging. So the big opportunity, of course, with this African Free Trade Agreement is this opportunity to access those markets. But that's only as good as those points that Goods and I was making about the ability to move those goods and services through borders, but also logistically on good transport networks. I mean, at the moment for us as the Atlantis SEZ, our biggest challenge for our existing tenants is the Port of Cape Town. Our ports, for example, in South Africa have some of the most expensive charges in the world, at one stage 160% higher than the rest of the world average. And certainly COVID made that a lot worse in terms of all the logistical challenges that we're still facing in sort of the aftermath of the pandemic and some of the shutdowns and so forth. So our big challenges really, and the ones that face our existing tenants are infrastructure related. It's things like ports, it's energy security, it's water security, and it's the ability to move that stuff to the desired market. So getting those things right, getting the policy environment right, getting the infrastructure systems and support things. I always joke and I say, people talk about the invisible hand of the private sector, but actually what you want when it comes to infrastructure is the invisible hand of government. And what I say by that is that when you flick the light switch, you want the electricity to flow. And when you turn on the tap, you want the water to flow. You don't really want to understand all the systems and processes that go on to make that happen. And they're quite complex. But it must just happen. And you should be able, from an investment and development perspective, to take that stuff for granted. in an ideal kind of scenario, be it your fiber connectivity, your transport logistics. So the more we can make, in a sense, those infrastructure services invisible, and another word for that might be seamless, then I think the better for our investment, and certainly the domestic appetite is there.
Matt, thank you. That's great introduction. Ben, coming to yourself, I'm going to maybe ask you a slightly more pointed question, if I may. And again, don't want to deflect your opening remarks, but sort of the mega trend of our time of 2022 really is food security in this part of the world. Article in The Economist recently talked about the horrific situation in countries like Somalia, not too dissimilar in large parts of Northwest Africa, around food security following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the supply side shock of food supply into the continent. What are your views on this currently, and is this resulting in as Stavros spoke about earlier, there was more realization of the imperative of localization as COVID struck because of the sense of crisis. I've never heard the word localization used so much as I did in the first quarter of 2020. Is there a similar sense of localization around food security in many swathes of the African continent or economies currently? What are your views, Ben?
Thanks, Martin, and thank you to the organizers of this great session. I have to say, the only difference now with the pre-COVID scenario, and looking at the current conflict that we're facing between Russia and Ukraine, is the sense of urgency. Solutions have been presented around bringing production closer to home for the last decades. Emphasis on agro-processing, on value add, on training. We've been putting a lot of emphasis on all these matters for as long as I've been working in agriculture. However, the difference now is urgency, and we're hoping that after going through COVID and looking at the conflict and the impact of the conflict, we will start seeing a lot more urgencies from our policymakers, but not just from our policymakers, but also from the private sector. So in our work, we tend to emphasize on the role of the private sector in developing agriculture and developing the entire value chain. But there's a role that the public sector needs to play. And I've been attending a lot of conferences recently where there are a lot of talks about the potential and opportunities that the continent offers, and they talk about available arable land. Yesterday, in one of the conversations, actually someone said, when you look at the food production currently, and you look at the potential that the African continent has, about 60% of our available arable land, whatever will be produced will be a surplus. So we are actually in a great position to produce a lot more, and for the continents to become to actually support a food secure world. However, land without 4 capitals has no value. You need finance, you need technology, you need equipment, and you need human capital. And I like what Matt said. When you look at the infrastructure, that has to be the basis of all that discussions and all the supports that you want to bring in on the African continent, that the infrastructure setup, whether it's hard infrastructure or digital infrastructure, or even from a policy of setting up institutions that will support the private sector and protect the private sector, sometimes are all taken for granted. So we need to look at all these elements before we can start talking about achieving a food secure world. Yes, we are in a crisis, but we need to start looking at what are the benefits of the free trade agreement on the African continent. And there are some challenges there that sometimes we take for granted. We spoke about infrastructure. Absolutely, there's an issue of infrastructure, but there's also an issue of knowledge. There were recent surveys that were done within the private sector. How many companies actually knew that they will benefit from the agreement? Very few. How many knew actually at what stage they were? Very few. How many actually trust in products that are made on the African continent? Very few. So we need to, there's a lot of capacity that we need to do. There's a lot of work that we need to do, but that work needs to include the private sector. When we're talking about the law of proximity and bringing in production closer to home, it costs pretty much the same for me to be able to supply, to actually gain access to inputs from South Africa, from Nigeria, from Ghana, than in China. The only difference is it's cheaper in China. So all those infrastructure, all that entire reality needs to be looked at very carefully. And I believe that we are in the right path, looking at everything that my fellow panelists have discussed. I do believe that this is the right time for us to put a little bit more emphasis, but we need to put urgency and we need to be a bit more proactive in terms of solutions, and rather than just presenting or beautiful solutions on paper without an implementation plan.
Ben, thank you. Matt, to come back to you, is that, you know, the phrase industrial policy has certainly come to the fore, as Stavros said, really in recent times, and Ben was saying exactly the same thing. There's a sense of urgency. I sense that the sense of urgency is now rapidly evaporating, sort of, dare I use the phrase, post-COVID. But why, even with dramatic crises recently, be it COVID, think pharmaceutical, localization, manufacturing, think food security now and enhanced localization. There seems to be just a lack of, there's almost this lack of drive from the vast majority of governments in the region around industrial strategy. So, but I'm coming on the positive note. I've read in recent months of the turnaround for the textile garment sector in South Africa, driven by the likes of TFG, Foschini Group, and others perhaps, who really, the localization agenda is very strong. It's based on a market, as has been mentioned. It's private sector driven by and large, enabled perhaps by some protective tariffs and the like. But that's really turned the corner. And as Ben mentioned, and was mentioned earlier, this is a sector that's bear the brunt of the uber competitiveness that China has been in the last generation. So in light, if we have automotive manufacturing success, we know all about that. Recently, we're getting gains, getting traction, should I say, in the garment manufacturing. What sectors, Matt, are on your agenda, which you think South Africa should, or perhaps other countries, should start to compete for, and we will see positive results from industrial strategy, rooted in pragmatism rather than just expectant ideology?
Wow, that is a big question. I'm gonna which is a little bit intimidating. I think what I'm gonna say is two things that before I sort of answer that question. I think in terms of how you posed it, that garment turnaround story is fantastic. I love that story. I think it really says so much about the depth and the resourcefulness of the private sector, and particularly, I think, in the context of South Africa, certainly the resourcefulness of our private sector manufacturing industry. I mean, it really is a wonderful story, but it's also a story that's built around hard work. It's built around building a really skilled base in order to service that industry. And as you know, there was the ability to draw in from previous skills. And Atlantis, where we sit, also has some of those very deep skills. And when we look at some of these areas, like, for example, solar panel manufacturing, or even wind tower manufacturing, the feedback that we are getting from our potential investors and even from existing tenants is that our factories in South Africa, and I'm sure this would be true anywhere in Africa, are as competitive and as productive, in fact, even sometimes more productive than any of the counterparts elsewhere in the world. There are many reasons for that. And in fact, going into that in a little bit more detail would be worthwhile. But I think one of the things we sometimes sell ourselves a little bit short on is that we're not competitive. I think we've shown we can be. I think it's not that it's easy. It's not that we just can roll over and it all just comes. But I think we have a lot of good systems and infrastructure in place to make ourselves competitive. And certainly the private sector has a role to play. For us personally, we're really interested in this growing green economy. We're firmly targeting that as a future opportunity. So certainly the solar panel space, the wind tower space, we don't think at this stage that the Western Cape could ever compete as a vehicle manufacturing or an electric vehicle manufacturing space. But we do see opportunities in some of the smaller type service vehicles, you know, your motorcycles, tripeds, maybe some light industry type electric vehicles and so forth, and maybe even electric or battery manufacturing as a focus area. More broadly than that, in the agricultural space, very interesting technologies emerging in that production space, which we're watching very closely. Of course, the pharmaceuticals, South Africa and Cape Town has some pharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities as well. So there are a number of different areas, and including construction and sort of green construction materials and things like insulation and those sorts of things. So these are all things that we see a market, not just in South Africa, but globally and also in the rest of Africa, and things that we would want to really leverage the African Free Trade Agreement in terms of being able to get those goods into the rest of Africa.
Kudzanai, do you agree? I think now we're getting there. It's okay. I'll let you off a hook briefly. Kudzanai, coming to yourself, is that, you know, you're in the sort of infrastructure support policy advisory space. Surely, as Matt mentioned, the so-called green agenda, think critical minerals, think all things battery-powered, power shift, if you will. There's a significant, decades-long to come tailwind for this industry. We've seen battery technologies arguably tied up already by the likes of the Americans, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese. Maybe that boat's already sailed. But in terms of more, you know, manufacturing of products, servicing of these products, what do you, from NBF's perspective, what do you think we overall or governments need to be thinking about to better enable green economy, if I can call it that, green economy, industrialization, deepening of value chains in this part of the world? Kudzanai?
Thanks for that question, Martin. No, and it's a great question. So, you know, what should governments be thinking about to better enable, you know, a green economy? I think the first key one is obviously identifying those key areas where you'll get the biggest returns, where you get the best bang for your buck, if you would like. And if you're looking at the South African economy as an example, that's obviously within the electricity sector, and it's also within the transportation sector. So if you're talking about the electricity sector, there's a lot of work that's already going on in terms of decommissioning of the Eskom coal fleet. And there's a lot of work as well that's currently going on in terms of new technologies such as green hydrogen. I think these are critical areas where the government needs to get behind those. So, and what do I mean by that? If you look at green hydrogen as an example, there is no substantive policy framework now that can guide new companies that want to establish themselves and start unlocking the entire value chain from a green hydrogen perspective in South Africa. We're currently involved in some of the work to craft that and to put something together. Some of this work is being funded by the GIZ as an example. And if you look at the current companies that are in play, they are going about this by obviously getting certain exemptions to set up certain facilities and do what they need to do to get the ball rolling. So one of the key things that the government can do is to accelerate the pace of creating frameworks that can enable key technologies such as green hydrogen to actually come to market. And as you know, both South Africa and Namibia are prime candidates and prime targets in order for us to be able to create green hydrogen on a massive export scale. But that policy framework has to be in place. And you've obviously got a lot of front runners that have come in that are setting that are essentially leading the charge. But it's by and large leaning on international standards in terms of your regulations, codes, and standards. And we don't have any of those locally. So I think that's one key area that where we've already identified that there's this particular element where you can actually have a technology that can accelerate the pace at which you can green the economy. The policy environment really needs to be put in place by the South African government. And I think the same applies as well if you're looking at transportation as an example, where you're looking at key policies such as road to rail and their impact in terms of helping to further green the economy, reducing carbon emissions. I think the policy stance there really needs to be clear. So if we take the current issues that you have that are impeding, as an example, a lot more cargo moving from road to rail, one of those key issues would be around vandalism, consistent cable theft. But one of the solutions that is currently on the table is dealing with the issue of where that all goes in terms of the markets, the smelting of where all that copper goes, and putting certain bans on export of all of that copper. This is a government issue that government can actually step in and say, look, we are banning the export of certain categories of this type of copper, which would naturally have been stolen from Transnet lines, etc. And that ultimately then trickles down to greening the economy via that road to rail sort of a migration. So I mean, those are just two examples within the hydrogen space, and perhaps something that's an organization such as your DTIC would have to do in terms of specific policies that can really try and assist in terms of moving the needle in terms of getting a green economy moving.
So thank you. Stavros, coming back to yourself, obviously you mentioned the fantastic work you've done as Aspen in collaboration with J&J around local pharmaceutical manufacture in very recent times. Has this recent crisis, this pandemic, it seems it's in a rearview mirror now, but if you look back the last 2 years, has this spurred a sense of urgency amongst government policymakers? Is there an enhanced embracing of all things free trade to allow pharmaceutical products, again, notorious, a very difficult sector or product to move across national boundaries because highly regulated? But we see as businesses African Continental Free Trade Agreement, it sounds great, we see the headlines, we all buy into it. But in terms of the sectoral details, maybe using pharma as an example, maybe you can give some other examples perhaps, how is this progressing? Where are the, rather than the platitudes, are we going to be seeing short-term wins? And if so, where will those wins take place? Which industry and perhaps which geography? Stavros?
Yeah. Martin, that's an excellent question. Am I seeing urgency? The answer is yes, but urgency doesn't always equal cohesion, right? Particularly policy cohesion.
Yeah.
So let me South Africanize this for a moment, and then I'm going to talk about the continent more at a macro level. I indicated earlier that we have the worst disease burden of any continent in the world. Yet we are a serial importer of medicines. That doesn't make sense. It's like kind of saying, in a different jurisdiction, you've got the biggest car market, but you're importing all the cars. It just makes no sense, right? So just to stay with that counterintuitive outcome for a moment, let me touch on HIV/AIDS. South Africa has 17% of the world's HIV infection rate, yet we constitute less than 1% of the world's population. So we're around 0.7, 0.8%, but have 17% of the HIV infection rate. It's a really sad indictment, and I'm talking, just to illustrate how counterintuitive this is. I'm talking something that's 3 weeks fresh. The antiretroviral tender gets awarded in South Africa 3 weeks ago, and we still continue to import most of our antiretrovirals. So this is despite trade and industry and treasury and DSTR, they're all saying we've got to localize the industry and we've got to go for the low-hanging fruit now. Surely to goodness, ARVs are low-hanging fruit. But the reality is when the health department acts, the health department says, well, you know what? I can buy this for R1 cheaper out of India, right? And I have to buy 10 million packs. So I'm going to be saving 10 million rand, okay? And they'll say, well, that's a good decision we took. It's actually an extremely poor decision. The reason being that they lost out on 3 rand tax and other multiplier impact per pack. So in that equation, the fiscus is actually 20 million rand worse off. So how on earth can it ever be a good decision? So this is where I start talking about policy coherence and policy coordination. So you've got these departments, you've got a presidency and a president, and President Ramaphosa led the crusade during COVID, he did, and were it not for him, I think we would have been in a worse position with vaccines than we actually are. So you've got the presidency that says we have to localize, we've got to build these capacities. As I said, DTRC, DSTI, etc., all on saying the same thing. But then health took a decision based on their narrow mandate. Now, if we are going to place localization at front and center of South Africa's economic reconstruction recovery plan, then this has to be cross-cutting. It requires a complete diminution, if not elimination in its entirety, of the silo effects that currently exist in government. And I'm afraid this is not only specific to South Africa, but to many parts of Africa. North Africa, the Maghreb countries are certainly doing a lot better. So if you look at a country like Egypt, they've got a farmer industrialization plan, they've got an import substitution strategy, and it's been successful. Okay, but we're not doing this in the rest of the continent. And even South Africa, which has the most sophisticated pharmaceutical industry, has the most industrialized economy on the continent, we are not getting the basics of localization right. We're not getting the basics of local procurement. And I really thought it was important that I illustrate that example. So when I speak to health say, but our mandate is to get ARVs to as many people as possible. So we can't entertain that 1 rand premium. The fact that they've awarded imported product at 6 rand higher than some of the locally produced product is a different discussion for a different day, Martin. I'm just looking at the basic fundamentals that the continent must get right here. The fundamental is what constitutes best value for money, not what is the cheapest product. And that's the mindset we have to change. The continent, we have to change it in our own country here, South Africa. So I'm afraid unless we get that principle right, we are destined to not succeed with our localization agenda. We're pinning our hopes as a country, as a continent, on industrializing. I think we talk about reindustrializing in South Africa. I'm not sure that we were ever industrialized to that extent. So whether it's reindustrializing or industrializing afresh, if we don't get that mindset right, I'm afraid we won't succeed. And the last point I want to make is, we talk a lot about Black industrialists in our country. And there have been some initiatives, but truth be told, you can count on one hand the Black industrialists that exist in our country. Where we've missed a real opportunity, I believe, is the public sector has a spend of around 1.2 trillion rand. Sure, some of that around 700 billion odd resides in salaries and other benefits, and about let's call it 600 billion resides in the procurement of goods and services. We should be putting that 500 to 600 billion to good use to trigger local procurement so that you can get guaranteed offtakes and long-term agreements for industrialists, including black industrialists. So we lament the fact that no one wants to borrow money to black industrialists because they don't have offtakes. Well, let's better utilize this 1.2 trillion, and you can multiply it, from the time we changed local procurement legislation exactly a decade ago now. So multiply that trillion by 10, and you've got 10 trillion rand. Missed opportunity, I'm afraid. So these are, Martin, the type of things we need to look at as a country. And, kind of whatever I'm saying applies to sub-Saharan Africa as well. So just as a final concluding remark then, I think we've got to break the silo mentality that exists. And to go back to what I was saying right at the beginning, we should be using the volumes that reside on the continent to make ourselves competitive. We've actually outsourced those volumes. In the case of pharma, we've outsourced those volumes to India and China, and all the benefits reside there. So I think we need to get our act together from, again, a perspective of aggregating volumes. Thanks very much.
Well, Stavros, I'm nearing the end of our conversation, but I want to, before I ask everybody to give their summaries, I've got another question to Ben. Ben, Stavros talks about the volume game, not just volume, but the competitiveness of the likes of India and China vis-a-vis, pharma products, medical supplies. But it's not just, of course, China's a very pervasive manufacturer. It doesn't so much move up the value chain as it has dominated the entire value chain in the last generation or so. So coming to Africa's side, is that, the topic of this conversation is what can Africa do better to drive growth post-COVID effectively, and how can this be supported by a African Continental Free Trade Agreement? I want to ask you a very provocative question. Is that Asia's success was not due to a regional free trade pact. Asia's success was underpinned by individual economies competing intensely, and that competition drove productivity and competitiveness, national competitiveness. In the likes of China, India, it wasn't so much a country competing as it was provinces in China or states in India. You have provinces in China which are terrible at manufacturing, but certain provinces, think Fujian, Guangdong in the south and east, are intensely competitive. Similar so in India. You have certain Indian states that are very, very competitive, and in services in particular, some others not. So in light of that, from an African perspective, I want to see African countries competing with each other. We always think we're in the same boat, but we should be competing. Which countries, I come back to, which countries do you think have recognized this crisis the last few years, are structurally reforming, that's a very loaded sort of phrase, doing the right thing to drive growth, and
Martin?
at the same time taking advantage of a free trade agenda? What are your views, Ben? I mean, who's winning here? Who's doing the right thing, and who's setting themselves up for longer term growth? And we'll go to conclusion after your views. Thank you.
Competitiveness has to be a key driver for the African continent. I'll just give you a simple example. I'm in Kinshasa and I'm struggling to log on a simple Zoom call. So if I'm a business, I will have to look at digitalization, and I'll have to look at what are the available infrastructure that will allow me to operate. Whether it's in agriculture, pharmaceutical, or manufacturing, we have to be able to compete. Removing trade barriers doesn't mean that we can't compete among ourselves, or even provinces can't compete among themselves. We here in the DRC promoting the special agro-processing zones. These zones have to be able to compete among themselves. You have government-led, who are sometimes taken or decided based on political decisions, and sometimes they're not competitive. When you have to look at private sector-led zones, they look at the competitiveness of the zone. So you can't remove that from the equation. as we move forward. So I'll leave it at that just before I get disconnected again. And
Ben, it's
hopefully
hoping
this can every one of you to come and set up in the DRC.
To conclude, I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to give a very brief way forward. What's your advice to governments in general, or be specific around how do they better drive growth? It seems obvious. There's a sense of urgency, Stavros, you say. There should always be a sense of urgency, particularly in underdeveloped poor countries. But a sense of urgency needs to translate into action. Matt, from your side, your conclusion, please, going forward. What do you think? What should be front of mind for African policymakers, governments now to drive growth going forward, taking advantage, if there is one, of a free trade agenda?
Yeah, I think the opportunities are there. I think the kind of innovation, the appetite for investment and growth is there in the private sector. I think African governments need to provide a really solid, certain long-term policy environment that is consistently upheld. It doesn't even have to be brilliant or good, but just be consistent and give that kind of certainty within which the private sector can make their decisions, and underpin that with infrastructure that is the basics, as Ben has said. Get that right on infrastructure, and I reckon a lot of the rest will take care of itself.
Matt, thank you very much. Good luck with Atlantis Special Economic Zone. I promise to come visit you soon, and I hope to see lots of things being made or serviced out of the zone. Kudzanai, you're from NBF, NEPAD Business Foundation. Again, you've heard this question before, what should African governments be doing better going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. It's really all about how government can leverage the private sector. I think private sector participation is the key in co-creation of the infrastructure solutions and the subsequent execution and implementation that needs to come after that. So, when you think about infrastructure development, in a sense, it's a response to market, economic, social needs, and designing that response is something that absolutely must be done in collaboration with the private sector. To give a practical example, and I think government needs to back it up as well when they say they want to do that. If you look at what is currently being done in South Africa in terms of trying to get third-party access off the ground to bring in private sector participation, the devil is in the detail. The detail of some of the key elements of what is being put on the table. Private sector said, look, certain elements of what you've proposed do not necessarily work, be it being told that you have to use the infrastructure as is with certain vos clauses, be the tenure period, 2-year tenure period, which of course will not be adequate for long-term investment for those kinds of assets, such as rolling stock. So where government has given a view, and we applaud certain positions they've taken to try and get private sector participation, they need to back it up with the detail. And I think if governments really try and get that co-creation off the ground, they can do amazing things. So, and this is something that we obviously keen to support. Thanks.
Kudzanai, thank you. Ben, your concluding statements, comments, please, besides wanting better Wi-Fi connectivity and broadband.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Martin. I think for me, is the current narrative seems to show that both government and the private sector are willing to work together, and governments are willing to make concessions to allow and create an environment that invites the private sector. But we really have to back that up, as Kudzanai mentioned now, and we have to be willing to challenge the status quo. When you look at from a financial perspective, when you look at agriculture, there are very few players that are willing to support small, medium-scale farmers, for example, who are responsible for 60% of everything that we consume. We have to find a way to challenge the status quo there. When you look at the DRC, again, I'll use an example as the biggest market for all our neighbors, our neighboring countries. The DRC is seen as the market. We need to change the status quo by inviting companies that can set up in the DRC who are closer to that market and become producers ourselves. And we're hoping that government will be able to to be brave enough to challenge the status quo, and the private sector will work with them along the way. As long as there's that commitment from them, we will see change and back up the urgency.
Ben, thanks for joining us. Much appreciated. Stavros, you started us off earlier. You will finish it. Give us your concluding sentence or your thoughts, please, as a way forward. In what's your advice really beyond what your fellow panelists have said about how do African governments better think about avoiding this marginalization I spoke about earlier, and really driving growth to be noticed by capital and attracting and generating value as you define it in their domestic economies?
Martin, a lot of today has centered around manufacturing and industrialization. Of course, one's got to be realistic about where you start and, you know, what strengths do you have immediately. But the realism and the pragmatism is critical. But I think it's been demonstrated over many decades that nothing grows economies better than manufacturing, and nothing creates more jobs than, you know, you get the up and downstream effects of manufacturing. So I think my advice is twofold. The first is we need, you know, each country should have a disciplined localization policy and execution thereof. You know, most countries have got the policy, but it's always the execution. And I spent a lot of time explaining the missteps in South Africa on ARVs, right? So that's the first thing, a disciplined localization policy that gets implemented and executed on. And secondly, is the continent needs to reduce the burden of doing business, the administrative burden, the red tape, etc. That's all got to be cut even further. I think there are good examples on the continent, like Rwanda, for example, where it has been cut, and I think the impact is there for all to see. So those are two closing bits of advice. Both would lead to economic growth. Thanks very much.
Gentlemen, Stavros, thank you. That's fantastic. And I'm glad you mentioned Rwanda. We wish we were more Rwandas to speak about in terms of, as you mentioned earlier, guys, countries driving competitiveness, countries differentiating themselves from the neighbors. And I think that's one of the lessons going forward. To conclude, final word, you know, we've just had if we think back, it's been a pretty traumatic, and Stavros, you've been the busiest guy in the room, literally for the last 2 years or so, around the COVID period. But it's really what countries do following crisis that sets their long-term trajectories going forward. I think back, late 1980s, early 1990s, political shock, Eastern Europe became emerging Europe. A structural shock, or a shock resulted in a shock to the system, resulted in a structural reform. Asia, late 1990s, there was a financial shock, financial crisis that resulted in structural reform and laid a foundation for long-term growth, development, and embedded middle-class societies. We've seen post-2014-15 a commodity shock, an oil shock, really rocking the fundamentals of a Middle Eastern economy, significant diversification from the likes of the UAE, led by the UAE, followed by Saudi Arabia and other countries. Now we've had this COVID shock, and the question I pose, a rhetorical question to all of us in this virtual room and beyond, is that we've had this crisis, but will the shock result in structural reform for those economies that have been marginalized and with a long economic scarring effect as a result? Question mark is out, and conversations like this, I think, are imperative for policymakers, government, business, capital, ultimately, to listen to and to think about as to how we drive growth and how do we structure reform following shocks to our economies. One that we have still very much is front of mind. Gentlemen, thank you very, very much. Great having a conversation with you. I learned quite a lot. Thank you. And thank you to the organizers again for bringing us together. Have a very pleasant day.